Moscow, November 1581. The corridors of Alexandrov Sloboda echoed with screams that froze the blood. Tsar Ivan Vasilievich, 51 years old with eyes injected with fury, had just struck his pregnant daughter-in-law for wearing clothes he deemed immodest. Elena Sheremetova lay on the floor, bleeding, while her gestating womb pulsed with the pain of a life that would soon be extinguished. Then he appeared, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, the heir to the Russian throne, 26 years old with a whole face disfigured by rage contained for decades. "Father," he screamed, his hands trembling, "this has to end." The old Tsar raised his iron staff with its steel tip, the same one he had used to crush the skulls of traitorous boyars, and his lips curved into a grimace that was half smile, half howl. "My son," he whispered with a voice that seemed to come from hell itself, "you dare defy me." The air thickened with the omen of the inevitable. The staff rose once more, spinning in the air like a death sentence, and descended with all the force of a man who had spent his life destroying everything he loved. The Tsarevich's skull opened like ripe fruit, and blood splashed the stone walls as the heir of Russia fell into his murderer's arms. "I killed my son," Ivan the Terrible screamed, kissing the bloodied face of his firstborn. "I killed my son." This was an open declaration of war, not against a foreign enemy, but against his own soul, against the last vestige of humanity that remained in the heart of a monster. To understand how a father can murder his own son, we must go back 50 years, to a place where darkness had already taken deep root. On August 25th, 1530, in the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, a child was born under a sky covered with black clouds that seemed to presage decades of blood. It was a time when mercy seemed weakness, where wolves howled closer to cities than ever before, where plagues swept through villages, leaving mountains of yellowed corpses upon which crows perched with obscene voracity. The baby was named Ivan Vasilievich, fourth of his name, son of Basil III, Grand Prince of Muscovy, and Elena Glinskaya, a woman of legendary beauty and fierce ambition. But this child would not be born in light, but in the shadow of palace conspiracies, where treason was served as frequently as bread. When Ivan was barely 3 years old, his father Basil died in such a strange manner that historians still debate whether it was murder. An abscess on the leg, the doctors said, an infection that turned into blood poisoning. But in the corridors of the Kremlin, between whispers and furtive glances, servants spoke of poison mixed with medicine, of boyars who smiled too much at the funeral. Ivan's mother, Elena, assumed the regency with an iron hand, ruling Russia in her son's name for 5 crucial years. But in 1538, when Ivan was only 8 years old, Elena died suddenly. Poisoning, they said again, though no one dared openly accuse the boyars who now looked at the small orphan with eyes hungry for power. That night, the boy Ivan was left alone in the enormous palace rooms, trembling under threadbare blankets while listening to the footsteps of men who no longer saw him as their future sovereign but as an obstacle. The boyars, that warrior aristocracy that had served his family for generations, now fought among themselves for control of the throne, using the child as a pawn in their deadly games. The Shuisky and Belsky families faced each other in a war of intrigues that left corpses in the Kremlin courtyards and bloodstains on sacred icons. Little Ivan and his deaf brother Yuri were treated worse than peasants. In his own words, written years later, Ivan would painfully recall how they raised us like vagrants and children of the poorest, how they went hungry while boyars feasted, how they wore old and torn clothes while nobles paraded in imported silks. One day, when he was 9 years old, Ivan saw Prince Ivan Vasilievich Shuisky sitting on the bench where his father used to rest, his elbow propped on the bed that had belonged to the late Tsar, his dirty boots on sacred chairs, looking at him without even the respect that a slave owes his master. In that moment, something broke inside the child. There was power in hatred. Ivan discovered there was strength in keeping each humiliation like a rosary bead of vengeance. Another night, drunk after a feast, a boyar came stumbling into the boy prince's room and put his boots covered in shit and mud directly on Ivan's bed, laughing while the 10-year-old boy clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms, holding back tears that would have been interpreted as weakness. Years later, Ivan would confess that often they didn't allow him to eat on time, that the boyars treated him like a decorative object they only brought out for official ceremonies, where he had to smile and wave, while inside his soul was being eaten away by a hatred that grew like a malignant tumor. But the true formative moment came when Ivan was 13 years old. Prince Andrei Shuisky, leader of the boyars, and the man who had most humiliated the young prince, convened a council meeting without even consulting Ivan. It was 1543, and something inside the teenager finally exploded. He summoned the loyal guards who remained and ordered with a voice that no longer trembled to capture Andrei Shuisky. The guards hesitated, looking at this skinny boy who suddenly spoke with the authority of a born king. "Bring him to me now," Ivan repeated, and there was something in his eyes, something dark and ancient that didn't belong to a 13-year-old child, that made the soldiers obey. They dragged Andrei Shuisky before the young prince, and the boyar who had put his boots on royal beds, who had stolen from the state treasury, who had treated Ivan like garbage, now trembled on his knees. Ivan looked at him for a long minute, savoring the fear in the eyes of the man who had tormented him for years. Then he pronounced the words that would change the course of Russian history. "Throw him to the dogs." And so it was. Andrei Shuisky was literally thrown to a pack of starving hunting dogs that tore him apart alive, while his screams echoed throughout the Kremlin. The other boyars who had come to protest stood paralyzed, watching as the child they had humiliated transformed into something completely different. That day, the child Ivan died. In his place was born Ivan, Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. On January 16th, 1547, at barely 16 years old, Ivan Vasilievich was crowned not as Grand Prince of Muscovy like his ancestors, but as Tsar of all the Russias. The word Tsar derived from Caesar, and with it Ivan claimed not only political power, but divine authority. He married shortly after to Anastasia Romanovna, a 16-year-old girl of serene beauty and gentle heart. For the first time in his life, Ivan knew something resembling love. She was his anchor, the only person who could calm the storms that raged within him. Together they had 6 children, though 4 would die in infancy, a common cruelty in that era, but one that each time tore away another piece of Ivan's soul. During the first years of his reign, Ivan showed flashes of the brilliant ruler he could have been. He reformed the administration, created legal codes, expanded Russian borders by conquering the Tatar Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan. When his armies took Kazan in 1552 after a brutal siege, Ivan ordered the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral in Red Square, with its impossibly colored domes that still today defy gravity and reason. Legend says that after finishing it, Ivan had the architects blinded so they could never create anything more beautiful. It was the perfect duality of his nature, capable of conceiving sublime beauty and absolute cruelty in the same breath. But in 1553, Ivan nearly died from a mysterious illness. While he lay on his deathbed, sweating, with fever and delirium, he asked the boyars to swear allegiance to his infant son as heir. Many refused. Some proposed instead his cousin Vladimir of Staritsa. Ivan heard every name, every betrayal, and though he survived the illness, something inside him hardened even more. Now he knew with certainty what he had always suspected. The boyars would betray him as soon as they had the chance. Then came 1560, the year when Ivan's world completely collapsed. Anastasia, his beloved wife, the only, light in his darkness, died suddenly after 13 years of marriage. She was only 30 years old. Poisoning, Ivan said immediately. The boyars killed her to destroy me. Modern historians debate whether she was really poisoned or died of natural causes. But for Ivan, there was no doubt. He had seen his father die in suspicious circumstances. He had seen his mother die poisoned, and now his wife had also been snatched away by the same invisible hands. The paranoia that had always lurked in the corners of his mind now seized him completely. He locked himself in his room for days, sobbing and banging his forehead against the icons until a permanent callosity formed on his skin. When he finally emerged, he was no longer the same man. His eyes had a glassy quality, as if looking at something no one else could see. The following year, his best friend and advisor Andrei Kurbsky defected to Lithuania and began leading attacks against Russian territory. The betrayal was like a knife in Ivan's heart. He wrote furious letters to Kurbsky, pages and pages of accusations and pain, revealing a mind fragmenting under the weight of real and imagined betrayals. In 1564, Ivan did something unprecedented. He abandoned Moscow. He left a letter saying he was abdicating because the boyars were all traitors. The city panicked. Without a Tsar, Russia would disintegrate into civil war. The boyars sent emissaries begging him to return. Ivan agreed, but with two conditions that would reveal the monster. He had become absolute and unlimited power, and the right to execute any traitor without trial or interference. The boyars, desperate, accepted. They had created a tyrant without restrictions. Ivan returned to Moscow and immediately established the Oprichnina, a state within a state controlled completely by him. He recruited 6,000 men called oprichniki, a secret police dressed in black, who rode black horses and carried dog heads hanging from their saddles as symbols of their canine loyalty to the Tsar. These men were licensed to rob, rape, and murder without consequences. Ivan gave them enormous properties confiscated from executed boyars, and the oprichniki squeezed the peasants, charging them in 1 year what they used to pay in 10. The purge began almost immediately. Ivan accused hundreds of boyar families of conspiracy based on non-existent evidence or confessions extracted under torture. The executions became increasingly elaborate, more sadistic. He boiled men alive in giant cauldrons while their families were forced to watch. He impaled others on wooden stakes that slowly pierced them from rectum to mouth, a process that could last days. He froze naked people in the ice of the Moscow River, but his masterpiece of horror came in 1570, when he decided that the city of Novgorod was planning to betray him and join Lithuania. There was no real evidence of this, only the whispers of a drunk informant named Petr Volinets, but for Ivan it was enough. In January 1570, the oprichniki surrounded Novgorod. What followed was a massacre that lasted 5 weeks. Men, women, and children were tied to sleds and thrown into the frozen Volkhov River, where they drowned under the ice while their families watched from the shore. 500 to 600 people were murdered each day. The Archbishop of Novgorod was sewn into a bearskin and hunted by dogs. Conservative estimates say 2,000 people died. Others speak of 60,000. Ivan personally oversaw much of the carnage, laughing as bodies floated under the ice like dark shadows. But even as he committed these atrocities, Ivan remained deeply religious in his twisted way. After each day of tortures, he prayed for hours, banging his head against the stone floor of his private chapel, begging God's forgiveness. He fasted, attended religious services multiple times a day, and compiled lists of the people he had ordered killed, sending them to monasteries with donations and asking them to pray for the souls of his victims. It was as if he believed he could buy divine absolution for each murder, that each prayer canceled out each scream of agony. His closest advisers, the few who remained, began to whisper that the Tsar had gone mad. And perhaps they were right. Modern historians speculate that Ivan suffered from bipolar disorder, temporal lobe syndrome, or perhaps syphilis in its final stages. But regardless of diagnosis, the result was the same. A man with absolute power and a mind, disintegrating under the weight of never-healed childhood traumas. Ivan married 7 more times after Anastasia's death, but none of these women found love or security in his arms. Some were sent to convents when they didn't produce male heirs quickly enough. Others disappeared in mysterious circumstances. His eldest son, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, grew up in this atmosphere of paranoia and violence. Unlike his father, young Ivan was diplomatic, intelligent, capable of negotiating where his father only saw enemies. But the relationship between father and son deteriorated year after year. Old Ivan forbade his son's first 2 wives from entering sacred places because they hadn't produced heirs, publicly humiliating them and sending them to convents. The Tsarevich obeyed, suppressing his rage. But when he took Elena Sheremeteva as his 3rd wife and she became pregnant, young Ivan felt hope for the first time. He would be a father. He would have his own family. Perhaps he could be a better father than his had been. Then came that day in November 1581. Ivan the Terrible entered his daughter-in-law's private chambers and found her dressed in light clothing, resting due to her advanced pregnancy. For the Tsar, accustomed to women covering themselves completely in the presence of men, this was an unforgivable offense. He began to beat her, slapping and kicking her in the belly while Anna screamed. Tsarevich Ivan heard the screams and ran to the room. For years he had accumulated resentments against his father, the humiliations of his previous wives, the Tsar's military failures in Livonia, the growing madness that was destroying Russia. All of it exploded in that moment. "Father," he shouted, "stop. You're destroying everything. You're destroying Russia. You're destroying our family." Ivan the Terrible turned toward his son with eyes that burned with fury beyond reason. For him, this wasn't a son worried about his pregnant wife. It was one more traitor, a potential boyar who dared defy him. He raised his iron-tipped staff, the same one he had used to crush enemy skulls for decades, and struck his son in the temple. The Tsarevich fell, blood gushing from his head, his eyes still open, but already glassy. Boris Godunov, who was present, tried to intervene, but also received blows. And then, in an instant of terrible clarity, Ivan saw what he had done. The staff fell from his hands with a metallic crash. He threw himself on his son, pressing his hands against the wound, trying uselessly to stop the blood that gushed in spurts. "I killed my son," he screamed again and again, kissing the bloodied face of the Tsarevich, sobbing with a pain that seemed to come from the deepest part of his broken soul. He called for doctors, for priests, for anyone who could save his son, but it was too late. Tsarevich Ivan lived for 11 more days, drifting in and out of consciousness. In a moment of lucidity, according to the chronicles, he looked at his father and whispered, "I die as a devoted son and the most humble of servants." Then he closed his eyes for the last time. During those 11 days, Ivan the Terrible didn't eat, didn't sleep, only prayed and cried beside his dying son's bed. When the Tsarevich finally died, something inside the old Tsar broke irreparably. The courtiers who saw him said he aged 20 years in one night, that his hair turned completely white, that his eyes lost all spark of life. Elena Sheremeteva, the daughter-in-law he had beaten, suffered a miscarriage hours after the incident. Losing the grandson Ivan would never know. The Tsar had destroyed not only his son, but the future of his entire dynasty. His only other surviving son, Fyodor, was weak both physically and mentally, completely incapable of ruling the vast empire that Ivan had built with blood. The following 3 years were a slow descent into total madness. Ivan withdrew more and more from state affairs, spending entire days in his private chapel, conversing with icons as if they were living people. Servants heard him talking to his dead son at night, asking forgiveness from a shadow that never answered. But even in his madness, there were moments of terrible lucidity, where Ivan understood perfectly what he had done. He had spent his entire life avenging himself on the boyars for stealing his childhood, for killing his parents, for betraying him at every step. And in the end, he himself had become what he most hated, a murderer of his own family. On March 28, 1584, Ivan the Terrible suffered a stroke while playing chess. He died a few hours later, at 53 years old, surrounded by priests praying for his damned soul. His son Fyodor assumed the throne, but he was so incompetent that real power fell into the hands of Boris Godunov, who had witnessed the Tsarevich's murder. Fyodor's reign was disastrous, and when he died without heirs in 1598, the Rurik dynasty that had ruled Russia for centuries became extinct. What followed was the time of troubles, years of civil war, famine, and chaos that almost destroyed Russia completely. All because a child had been traumatized, because the boyars had humiliated an 8-year-old orphan, because no one had healed the wounds of a broken soul before giving him absolute power over millions of lives. But perhaps the most tragic thing about Ivan the Terrible's story isn't the violence he committed, but understanding that at some point he was a victim before becoming a killer monster. That 3-year-old child who saw his father die, that 8-year-old orphan who was despised and starved by the men who should have protected him, that teenager who learned that power comes from fear because he never knew love, that man who finally found tenderness in Anastasia only to see her die poisoned. All those Ivans died long before the staff struck his son's head. Modern psychologists have a saying: if you expose a child to darkness long enough, they eventually become the darkness itself. Ivan the Terrible is the perfect example of this terrible truth. Every humiliation he suffered planted a seed of violence. Every betrayal he witnessed or imagined added another layer of paranoia. Every love he lost pushed him deeper into the abyss. And when he finally had the power to avenge himself, he couldn't stop, because vengeance never heals. It only creates more darkness. The Russian painter Ilya Repin would capture this moment in 1885 with his masterpiece Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan, showing the old Tsar with bulging eyes of horror and regret, holding his dying son's body, desperately trying to stop the blood he himself had spilled. It's one of the most disturbing paintings ever created, because it captures not just the act of violence, but its impossible resolution. That moment where the murderer realizes what he has done and discovers there's no way to undo it, that some actions are so irreversible they condemn you to hell in life. So I ask, what transforms a person into a monster? Is it the circumstances of their childhood, the traumas that never healed, the betrayals they never forgave? Or was there something intrinsically broken in Ivan from the beginning, a predisposition toward cruelty that circumstances simply unleashed? Perhaps we'll never know for certain. But what we do know is this: Ivan the Terrible wasn't born terrible. He was born like any other child, vulnerable and needing love. It was the hands of cruel adults, the boyars, who despised him, the conspirators who killed his parents, who sculpted a frightened orphan, transforming him into the most brutal tyrant Russia would ever know. And in the end, his greatest victim wasn't any of the thousands he murdered, but his own son, the only person who could have redeemed his legacy, who could have healed the wounds of generations. But Ivan destroyed that possibility with a single blow of his cursed staff, condemning not only his family, but all of Russia to years of chaos and suffering. Perhaps he was never truly evil. Perhaps he simply learned to survive within evil. But the result was the same: a sea of blood It drowned everything he could have ever loved. Tell me in the comments what you think about Ivan the Terrible. Was he a monster from birth, or did circumstances create him? Could he have been saved with love and modern therapy, or was he too broken to be repaired? And if you enjoyed this dark story from history, give it a like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more tales about the tyrants who changed the world. Until next time.